Muy buenas tardes, señoras y señores. Bienvenidos al auditorio del Museo Nacional del Prado. Soy David García Cueto, jefe de colección de pintura italiana y francesa del barroco en esta institución, y es un placer darles la bienvenida a un nuevo ciclo de conferencias que presentamos en el día de hoy. El ciclo, como posiblemente muchos de ustedes ya han podido advertir, se titula Caravaggio y la pintura del naturalismo. Nos va a llevar en 5 sesiones, a partir de la de hoy, a un viaje por la obra, el genio de uno de los grandes creadores de la historia del arte, Caravaggio, pero también su influencia en la pintura europea de su tiempo. Por tanto, vamos a tener 2 conferencias, las 2 primeras, la de hoy y la del próximo sábado, que tratarán en sí sobre la figura de Caravaggio, y 3 sucesivas que lo harán sobre la influencia que este artista tan fundamental ejerció en su tiempo, no ciñéndonos solo a la propia Italia, sino también abriendo esa visión a la península ibérica, a los Países Bajos, a otros territorios europeos de aquel momento. La conferenciante de esta tarde nos va a ofrecer una visión específica sobre las pinturas de Caravaggio que conserva el Museo de Viena, en el que ella trabaja como conservadora. Pero antes de hacerles la presentación específica de la conferenciante de esta tarde, permítanme que, aunque sea de forma muy rápida, sobrevuele por las otras 4 que seguirán, para que puedan ustedes también decidir si son de su interés y si quieren, pues a lo mejor reservar esa fecha en su agenda cuando llegue el momento. El próximo sábado 17 tendremos a la profesora María Cristina Terzaghi de la Universidad de Roma III, que nos hablará, como les decía, sobre Caravaggio y su obra, pero tomando como punto de partida la exposición que ella está comisariando en este momento en la ciudad de Roma sobre Caravaggio, a propósito del año jubilar 2025, que tiene este como uno de sus eventos fundamentales. Seguirá el 21 de mayo la profesora de la Universidad de Burgos, Ana Diegues Rodríguez, que tratará, ya abriendo el tema a lo que es la influencia de Caravaggio en otros lugares de la geografía europea y en otros artistas. Hablará Ana Diegues de la relación entre Rubens y Caravaggio, cómo Rubens pues va a ser admirador, copista, cómo va a tomar elementos del arte caravaggesco que luego él transmitirá también en el contexto de la Europa bajo la égida de la cultura flamenca. El día 24 de mayo tendremos al profesor de la Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, Rafael Japón, que considerará la influencia del caravaggismo en la península ibérica, tratando de centros creativos como Toledo, Valencia, Sevilla o Madrid, donde la influencia de este autor tan fundamental calará de manera rápida y ejercerá influencia en los pintores locales. Y ya yo mismo cerraré el ciclo el día 4 de junio tratando sobre la visión de Caravaggio desde el Museo del Prado. ¿Qué obras de Caravaggio y su estela conservamos? ¿Cómo han llegado hasta aquí? ¿De qué maneras han sido expuestas a lo largo de los más de 200 años de historia que tiene esta institución a sus espaldas? Y de esta manera, pues, configuraremos, como les decía, este ciclo de 5 conferencias, 2 específicas sobre la figura de Caravaggio y 3 sobre su influencia. El ciclo ha sido posible gracias a la iniciativa del Centro de Estudios. Tiene el soporte económico y el apoyo de la Fundación de Amigos, y bueno, pues agradezco muy especialmente al director adjunto, al jefe de la colección del siglo XVIII y a nuestra representante del Centro de Estudios también la presencia en la tarde de hoy. Bueno, y ya sí que voy a introducirle brevemente, para no robar tiempo de lo fundamental, a nuestra conferenciante de esta tarde, que es la conservadora del Museo de Historia del Arte de Viena, Gudrun Swoboda. Es un enorme privilegio, un gran placer tener con nosotros a una de las colegas más sólidas y veteranas que podemos encontrar en el ámbito de la conservación en Europa en este momento. La doctora Swoboda, desde el año 2009, sirve como conservadora de la pintura italiana, española y francesa en el Museo de Bellas Artes de Historia del Arte de Viena, y, aparte de su actividad como conservadora, editando catálogos razonados, por ejemplo, de la pintura caravaggesca, también destaca muchísimo como comisaria de exposiciones. Algunas exposiciones realmente muy importantes, muy novedosas en su punto de partida, como fueron Caravaggio y Bernini, como fue más recientemente Ídolos y Rivales. Y también hay que poner en relieve la actividad docente de la propia doctora Swoboda, que imparte cursos sobre historiografía, museografía, gestión del museo en la Universidad Austríaca. Es, por tanto, una colega con la que, por razones que todos ustedes conocen, es decir, por la dinastía de los Habsburgo, que tanto une Viena con Madrid, que tanto explica de lo que nosotros somos y también de lo que ellos son, pues aparte de eso nos une una positivísima relación científica. La doctora Swoboda ha elegido 3 de las pinturas de Caravaggio que conserva en su colección en el Museo de Viena. Son pinturas representativas de distintos momentos y también de distintos formatos en la obra de Caravaggio. Lo va a hacer con una mirada muy propia de conocedora, es decir, de la persona que examina de cerca las obras y saca conclusiones de su análisis visual. Ustedes podrán escucharla, quien quiera, en inglés, ella hablará en inglés, y si no, pues tienen a su disposición la traducción simultánea al español. Y el título de la conferencia en nuestras lenguas sería La inventiva de Caravaggio, 3 cuadros del Kunsthistorisches Museum de Viena. Muchísimas gracias. Les dejo con la doctora Gudrun Swoboda.
Buenas tardes, señoras y señores. Muchas gracias, profesor García Cueto, por su amable presentación, y muchas gracias también por esta oportunidad de poder hablar hoy aquí en mi museo favorito. Para mí es un gran placer y un honor hablar aquí donde trabajan tantos historiadores de arte destacados y destacadas. Esta invitación preciosa del Centro de Estudios me ha llevado a volver a ocuparme de Caravaggio. En los próximos 50 minutos presentaré algunas ideas anteriores junto con ideas nuevas que me llevan por terrenos irregulares y sobre la que todavía no he publicado nada. Por eso les pido comprensión si el texto no está del todo desarrollado y si no puedo dar la conferencia en español. As I have the honor of being the first to speak about Caravaggio in this lecture series, it seems appropriate to begin with a few introductory remarks about this extraordinary artist and the profound influence he had on 17th century painting. The painter's biography is more or less well known and has recently attracted at least as much attention as his paintings. Michelangelo Merisi, who was later to be named after his native town in Lombardy, Caravaggio, came to Rome in 1592 at the age of 21 after a brief apprenticeship in Milan. In Rome, he was soon accepted into the circles of influential patrons like the Borghese, the Mattei family, the Giustiniani, the Gerasi, etc., etc. In 1599, he received his first public commission, the decoration of the Contarelli Chapel in the Church of St. Luigi dei Francesi. With an impetuous temperament, he got into several conflicts, some of them violent, and he was forced to flee Rome in 1606 after a manslaughter. He subsequently spent time in Naples, Malta, and Sicily, where he produced numerous important paintings, mainly of a religious nature. Hoping for a papal pardon, he died in 1610 at the age of 38 on his return journey to Rome. However, tonight's focus is primarily on painting. Caravaggio's bold chiaroscuro painting, his sometimes blatant naturalism, his working methods in front of the model, his intense reinterpretations of traditional pictorial forms, and all this, together with his unadjusted, contradictory character, soon turned the Lombard painter into a mythical figure. His fama quickly spread throughout Europe. Although he avoided turning his studio into a training ground for other painters, his style and pictorial solutions, and some extent also his methods, were eagerly taken up by others. Initially, this was mainly in the places where he had worked, in Rome, Naples, and Sicily. From Rome, his art was also received in France and the Netherlands. In the first 30 years of the 17th century, Caravaggism was the most important alternative to the classicism spread in Rome by the Bolognese painter Agostino e Annibale Carracci and their pupils. The stylistic characteristic of Caravaggism include this effective chiaroscuro painting, which means that the subjects are very plastically modeled and the shadow and light zones are clearly separated, less idealized subjects, a preference for the half-figure format, which brings the figures even closer to the viewer, and the fondness of genre-like themes or motifs. Due to the fact that the Caravaggesque painters each brought their own regional, stylistically different baggage with them before they came into the contact with Caravaggio, there are very different manifestations of the new style of painting. Closely with Caravaggio associated in a biographical way are Orazio Gentileschi, Orazio, the father of Artemisia Gentileschi, who is probably better known today and who was a co-defendant in a trial brought up by a fellow painter. Mario Miniti from Sicily, who also served Caravaggio as a model. Cecco del Caravaggio, whose affinity is already evident in his name. Manfredi, and Manfredi's half-figure depiction of scenes of soldiers and musicians, mainly from the second decade of the 17th century, were so successful in Italy and among the Northern European painters that the German painter and theorist Joachim von Sandrart could almost speak of a Manfredi method of pictorial narrative, and he called it the Manfrediana Methodus. Carlo Saraceni, who was born in Venice and may also have known Caravaggio personally. In Naples, the master may have met Giovanni Battista Caracciolo. And Naples, in this city where Caravaggio stayed twice, from 1606-07 and 1609-10, and there he exerted a significant influence on the local school of painting, and this was also a bridge that brought Caravaggism to Spain. The direct influence of Giuseppe de Ribera, who spent most of his life in Naples, which, as you know, was under Spanish rule in the 17th century, and other painters active in Spain, such as Pedro de Orente and Francisco Ribalta, who adopted stylistic elements of Caravaggism partly through contact with Italian artists. They also played an important role. Occasionally, the Caravaggism of certain painters was not fed by their own experiences in Italy, but was conveyed second-hand via traveling artists. The most prominent example is Rembrandt, who was certainly not in Italy, but who was able to learn about the new Caravaggist tendency directly from friends and workshop colleagues. Peter Paul Rubens, on the other hand, knew works by Caravaggio from his own experience and met him in Rome. We will come back to him. Critics and theorists alike considered Caravaggio's manner to be specific and worth to mention. An early example is the Italian physician Giulio Mancini, who died in 1630, who already recognized Caravaggio as the leader of a new school. Later, Giovanni Pietro Bellori, the most influential Italian writer of the 17th century, was to describe Caravaggio's influence in particularly vivid terms as a kind of confusion of taste. In his work, Le vite dei pittori, scultori e architetti moderni, which was published in 1672, but which was already circulating in the 50s, in this book he describes how the young artists were drawn to gaze upon the miraculous power of Caravaggio's work and then to imitate him. And I quote Bellori, "Nevertheless, many artists were taken by his style and gladly embraced it, since without any kind of effort, it opened way to easy copying, imitating common forms, lacking any beauty. Thus, as Caravaggio suppressed the dignity of art, everybody did as he pleased, and what followed was a contempt for beautiful things, the authority of antiquity, and Raphael destroyed." According to Bellori, Caravaggio's power of those who were taken by the novelty of his work came close to a magical, irresistible enchantment. The enormous influence of Caravaggio's innovative use of chiaroscuro, on the one hand, for other artists, both in Italy and across Europe, has always been recognized by Bellori as well as by many other men and others who came both in Italy and beyond. Just as well known as the lasting influence of Caravaggio's chiaroscuro painting is the fact that he used these preferred subjects and formats that were also very fast imitated by other painters. As already mentioned, he made a significant contribution to the popularity of half-length figure format at the beginning of the 17th century. The boom in genre-like motifs observed in the same period, card players, musicians, soldiers, and so on, they all owed a great deal to him, as did the naturalism that accompanied them. Equally significant and influential, however, and this is what I would like to show in my lecture now, were his inventions on the level of expressive gestures, composition and iconography, and pictorial narrative. I would like to illustrate this with 3 examples. The choice of example is primarily justified by the fact that all these 3 works are in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, which is why I know them better than other works. And in addition, these works are very different from one another in terms of their respective subjects and formats, and consequently reveal the range of Caravaggio's inventiveness particularly well, I think. The works in question are the Coronation of Thorns, David with the Head of Goliath, and the Madonna of the Rosary. For stylistic and other reasons, these 3 paintings can be dated to between 1600 and 1603. All 3 were probably painted during Caravaggio's Roman period, and each of these paintings reveal in a specific way what was new about Caravaggio's painting and what is still captivating about it. Let us begin with the Coronation of Thorns, a painting in which, in my opinion, the specifically new and radical is the easiest to recognize. The evangelists, with the exception of Luke, report that Jesus of Nazareth was crowned with thorns as a mockery during his passion, given a reed as a scepter and a red cloak as a further royal sign. Caravaggio depicts all this in an undefined space where two henchmen are about to torment Christ's head, crowned with thorns, with canes. A third man in armor, dressed almost in contemporary dress, observes the events from a slightly lower position, leaning against the parapet, as if witnessing them from another period. Despite the cruelty depicted, the scene is characterized by a certain intimacy and silence. Caravaggio masterfully depicts the lightning conditions on the metal surface in order to contrast them visually with the naked upper body of Christ. The soldier's beautifully painted hand, framed with the white shirt, comes close to Christ's and seems to be adjusting to it. The criticism voiced by contemporaries that Caravaggio, instead of having ideas in mind, only worked from living models and dal naturale, seems to find confirmation in the Viennese painting. We are suddenly confronted with the physical violence exerted on the exquisite body of Christ by the henchman depicted in rough, open brushstrokes. Christ's vital, powerful body, complete with muscles and tendons, is depicted just as directly, but he now appears to be absorbed in itself with half-open eyes gazing into the void. From a compositional point of view, it is remarkable that Christ's tortured naked body is not overlapped by any figure and is nevertheless presented untouched in the center, like a self-contained devotional image. On a motivic level, it is striking that the mocking scepter held by Christ is of the same type as the canes with which the torturers tormented him. It is also noticeable that the two canes in the upper part of the painting form a striking V-shaped figure. Since we know from an archive find that the painting was made for one of the most important and most educated patrons in Rome, the Marchese Giustiniani, we can assume that this V is an allusion to the patron's first name, Vincenzo. As the mocking scepter under the two canes is visually associated with them, it can also be read as a letter, in this case as a capital I. And I recalls the Latinized form of the patron's surname, Justinianus. Artists such as Manfredi and Barburen, who also worked for Vincenzo Giustiniani, did not miss the detail. They gladly included Caravaggio's idea in their paintings. Perhaps, ladies and gentlemen, you are skeptical about such interpretations. If so, perhaps I can convince you by pointing out that the same type of allusion has also been identified in another painting for the Vincenzo Giustiniani, now in Berlin, the famous Amor. The much clearer V and I forms in this highly ironic painting, for instance, if you look on the left corner bottom, they do not only relate to the V and the I of Vincenzo Justinianus, but also to the triumphant boy and the saying, Amor vincit omnia. Love triumphs over everything else, which was very well known at the time. But back to the Vienna painting. Perhaps the most astonishing motif overall is the exposed neckline of Christ in the brightly lit center of the piece. As a minimal but highly effective form of expression, it refers to the humble assumption of fate that will be fulfilled for the Son of God with the Passion. Just like the mocking scepter which Christ has not dropped despite everything, but accepted as such. The fact that it is God himself who submits to torture here and allows himself to be humiliated despite his infinite sublimity over his tormentors does not to seem go unnoticed. In any case, we are encouraged to vividly imagine that the man in the dark armor, sitting on the left of the picture, is gazing at this paradoxical God as if spellbound, precisely because we cannot clearly see his shadowed face, and are instead invited to infer from his posture how he is looking and where he is looking. This experience is therefore extremely vivid for us. We are encouraged to look at what is happening as if through his eyes. But nothing illustrates Christ's self-surrender more vividly than the brightly illuminated shoulder and neckline in the center of the painting. The motif is not entirely new. It can already be found to some extent in Titian's impressive interpretation of the same subject. Caravaggio, however, knew how to sharpen the motif in a characteristic way and lended a hitherto unknown intensity of expression. Christ's head is violently pushed downwards by the torturers, and his hair, falling downwards, further intensifies this impression of movement. The humiliation goes so far that Christ's head barely protrudes above his right shoulder. Strong brush strokes on the neck indicate a strong tension and draw our attention to this area. Between the shoulder and the head, however, there is an astonishing long, almost horizontal neckline, the visual epitome of a sacrificed lamb, la nuca d'agnello, the lamb's neck. Perhaps it's no exaggeration to say that never has a more expressive contour line been painted than this one. In any case, it is one of this painter's most significant invention which, as I tried to show, go far beyond the striking chiaroscuro, the pointed naturalism, and the skillful use of the half-figure format that brings the action so close to us. The fact that Caravaggio's contemporaries, especially the artists, the painters, were also receptive to the power of this motif. This is indicated by the fact that it was imitated several times within a short period of time. Variations on the humiliation of Christ's head depicted by Caravaggio and on the exposed nuca d'agnello can be found, for example, as I show here, in Orazio Gentileschi, but also Bartolomeo Manfredi, Valentin de Boulogne, or Dirk van Baburen, and I could show a few more. Of course, it is also worth noting that none of his successors were able to achieve the same intensity as the prototype. The peculiar melody of the line painted by Caravaggio, whose expressive power is probably also due to erotic impulses, could obviously not be easily continued. It is interesting to note that no one else dared to place the neckline so decisively at the center of attention and at the center of the picture as Caravaggio. Let us turn to the second example. Caravaggio explored the story of the young David, who was a simple shepherd before he became king, in the last three paintings that I show you here, the one now in the Prado, the Kunsthistorisches Museum, and in the Galleria Borghese in Rome. Today I would like to talk only about the Vienna painting. Here David is depicted as a poorly dressed yet handsome youth, The shirt, only half covering his upper body, is reminiscent of ancient garments. The bag he's carrying on his back identifies him as a shepherd. The depiction from slightly below, upward di sotto in su, indicates that he has become a hero. According to the Bible, David had filled the shepherd's bag with pebbles, ammunition for a slingshot, on his way to his huge, seemingly much stronger opponent Goliath. In his right hand, however, he is not holding the sling, but a sword, probably the one he took from the giant Philistine, who was struck in the head by a surprise hit in order to cut off his head. Which, with this gaze and gesture, he addresses a person who is not visible to us. Is it King Saul himself, to whom he was returned after the deed is done, to present him with the head of the slain enemy as a trophy? The painting thrives on the contrast between the beauty of the youth and the horror, aurore, of the severed head he presents, from the base of whose neck blood still flows, and which almost seems to protrude from the picture. Highlights enliven the temple and nose of the head, and while the gaze is extinguished, a tooth flashes in the mouth, which is open as if to scream. What I would like to draw your attention to now is the special way in which David is holding the sword. This peculiarity will perhaps become clearer if I first show you a few older depictions of the David and Goliath scene, chosen at random. In contrast to them, Caravaggio's depiction is characterized not only by the dramatic chiaroscuro, the narrow framing, and the resulting focus, but also by a kind of irony. Even now that he has defeated Goliath and appropriated his sword, the young hero is still making a gesture that reveals his socialization as a shepherd. You see, he shoulders the sword. Performed with a sword, this gesture is quite unusual. Unlike shouldering a shepherd's staff, which is very usual and part of the common repertoire of shepherds' depictions. Here you can see some examples from the late period of the Roman Empire, as well as another depiction, a 16th century German woodcut or a Dutch engraving, and here you see the shepherd staff in the left background, which was probably made shortly before Caravaggio's painting. The ironic twist that Caravaggio gives the motif could also have been a precise narrative meaning. Perhaps he wanted to allude to an earlier moment in the biblical story, the moment when David left behind the armor with which Saul wanted to equip him before the battle with Goliath, because he was uncomfortable with the sword and, as the biblical text explicitly states, exchanged the sword for the familiar shepherd's crook. In any case, Caravaggio proves to be an ironist here, inviting us to recognize in the high object, the sword, a low one, the shepherd's crook. A closer look at the sword reveals gold on the scabbard and the hilt, which has been applied with a brush in finely drawn lines. What is being shouldered here, like a shepherd's crook, is obviously a particularly valuable, noble sword. With regard to the genesis of the motif, it can once again be seen, as with the neckline in the painting of the crowning with thorns, that Caravaggio did not completely reinvent the motif, A much earlier example can be found in a work of the painter Cimo da Conegliano, who was active in the Veneto around 1500. But in this case too, Caravaggio has sharpened the motif in a peculiar way and lent it a new kind of expressive intensity and intellectual depth, the meaning of which is, admittedly, almost impossible to comprehend rationally. Moments of auto-aggressive eroticism flow into his formulation or reformulation. David almost seems to be cutting himself. As you can see, the blade does not rest far from his neck on his naked skin, on which it casts a hard shadow that is almost like a cut. In this case, too, the painter's contemporaries, in particular the so-called Caravaggisti, but also later followers, noticed the innovation and gladly adopted the motif. I put together a few variations on the motif on the following slides that you can see here. Probably closest to Caravaggio's original is Nicolas Régnier, one of the French Caravaggisti who painted in Rome at the same time as Caravaggio and also for the same patrons. Here you have a later variant when he had left Rome and was based in Venice, but still adherent to the model for the famous, now long dead, Caravaggio. An example from Dirk van Baburen, who was a Dutch painter and one of the Utrecht Caravaggisti, and like Régnier, worked in Rome for the same patrons. Ottavio Vanini, an Italian painter from Florence, who was trained in Rome, and we are now further removed from Caravaggio's close circle, but you can still follow his radiance. Tanzio da Varallo is a Lombard painter who developed a very bold and personal style based on his training in his father's workshop and his exposure to the works of Caravaggio in Rome. Bernardo Strozzi, a painter born in Genoa who first became acquainted with Caravaggism at second hand, but also spent some time in Rome in the 1625. And finally, a Spanish example, which, however, raises questions. As far as we know, the painter Antonio de Castillo y Saavedra never worked in Italy, but in Cordoba and Sevilla. Whether this composition can actually be traced back to Caravaggio's painting is uncertain, although there are striking parallels in the clothing. If you look at this half-open white shirt revealing the naked breast and the fist holding Goliath's head. A print after the painting that was executed around 1665 might be a possible source. But we find parallels also in the color scheme. Note these mustard yellow trousers. Could Antonio de Castillo have seen Caravaggio's painting? We know that for a couple of years, the Caravaggio painting belonged to Juan de Tassis y Peralta el Conde de Villamediana, who had it in his luggage when he left Genoa for Spain in 1615. However, very soon again, after Villamediana's death in 1622, it had already left the country for England. So I would assume that the Spanish painter used a copy after the painting as a model, but as for now, this must remain an hypothesis. In any case, the examples cited show that some 17th century painters recognized the originality of Caravaggio's invention, even if they were rarely able to achieve its peculiar intensity. The autoaggressive trait of David's gesture which almost seems to cut into his own flesh, and in this way, his successors no longer show that. It is interesting to note that the motif was rationalized over time, as here, for example, in Jacob van Oost, who was a Flemish painter who was in Rome from 1621 to 1625. These are the years when Caravaggism was at its heyday. This artist focuses on the great weight of the sword that David had taken from the giant Goliath. It is made clear that it had to be shouldered because of its weight. Perhaps transformation of this kind can be interpreted, as Michael Fried has suggested, as creative commentaries on Caravaggio. Further examples of Caravaggio's originality and inventiveness beyond chiaroscuro, naturalism, and half-figure format can be found in the Madonna of Rosary. This is by far the largest painting in the Kunsthistorisches Museum by Caravaggio. And please allow me to talk a bit longer about this highly sophisticated and very complex painting. It's because it raises a number of questions that remain unresolved to this day, and questions that concern also the actual extent of the impact that Caravaggio's art had on 17th century painting. The Madonna of the Rosary is the only altarpiece painted by Caravaggio whose genesis has not yet been reconstructed. Neither its patron, whose portrait is embedded on the left side of the painting, nor the original location, presumably a Dominican church, are known. However, we are surprisingly well informed about the early history of the painting. It was mentioned already in 1607 in a letter from Naples, where it was kept by two Flemish artists. From there, the painting made its way to Amsterdam, where it was then donated to the Dominican church in Antwerp by a group of artists, including Peter Paul Rubens, and it only arrived in Vienna in the late 18th century as a gift to Emperor Joseph II. The Madonna of the Rosary is obviously a paradigmatic example of the power of Caravaggio's chiaroscuro painting. The figures stand before us like tangible bodies. The illusion created by painterly means is overwhelming. In our museum, I like to hang this painting so that it can be seen from afar. It looks very impressive, even from a great distance, and it is also able to attract the attention of the visitors. Or vice versa, you feel that the painting is looking at you from a great distance. At the same time, the painting contains much that only becomes apparent when viewed up close. Only when you come closer, when you are standing in front of the painting, like a priest reading the Mass, then you meet the gaze of the patron portrayed on the left side. It seems that Caravaggio created the painting for a very special spatial situation, which unfortunately we can no longer reconstruct as long as the original intent location is unknown. If you take a closer look at the composition, it becomes clear that the painting is probably Caravaggio's most classical altarpiece. The unusually clear, symmetrical composition and the gravity of some of the figures are reminiscent of altarpieces by his contemporary Annibale Carracci. This is the important painter who came to Rome from Bologna and who was later positioned by the art theorist Giovanni Pietro Bellori, which I mentioned at the beginning, as Caravaggio's opponent, namely the one who knew how to paint he was on the right path from which Caravaggio had deviated, according to Ballori. However, documented statements by Caravaggio prove that there was no simple opposition. On the contrary, he declared himself to hold no contemporary painter in higher esteem than Annibale Carracci. It is quite possible that he was inspired by Annibale Carracci when composing the Madonna of the Rosary. The Madonna with the Christ child is enthroned in the central axis of the painting. She appears in a highly elevated, isolated position in front of an apsis-like space, accompanied at the side by a column to which a voluminous curtain is attached. From the enthroned Madonna, the action gradually unfolds downwards. Mary instructs Saint Dominic to distribute rosaries to the faithful kneeling in the foreground, who eagerly stretch out their hands. On the left edge is this group with our already mentioned patron in contemporary dress. He is seeking shelter under the cloak of Saint Dominic. His direct gaze from the picture can also be understood as an invitation to follow his example. The combination of compositional rigor and naturalistic immediacy is remarkable. The common people with lively gestures, barefoot and with dirty souls, from a sharp contrast to the idealized group of saints. The naturalistic attention to detail breaks through the idealizing imagery. It refers to Caravaggio's interest in physical presence, which was much criticized by his contemporaries. Giovanni Pietro Bellori, who was already mentioned, was to put this way long after Caravaggio's death. Here, and I quote, Caravaggio abandoned the study of drawing and of artistic theory, choosing instead to copy only nature, and without any selection, he painted everything that came before his eyes, even if deformed and ugly. Thus it happens that what is a defect in nature becomes an error in painting. End of quote. The dirty feet, however, have a precise narrative meaning in Caravaggio's work. They do not only illustrate poverty, but also show that the faithful have come a long way to get here. In addition, a work such as the Madonna of the Rosary shows that Caravaggio's work cannot be said to be one-sidedly focused on naturalistic details. The composition of the painting is well thought out, and this is also confirmed by the fact that Caravaggio carefully repositioned certain figures as X-ray, and some technical analysis have proven. So not only the technical analysis with the repositions were an argument for this well thought out composition, also the numerous symmetries and this reflection and the calculated contrast speak in favor of a very thoroughly worked out concept. Opposite Saint Dominic, on the other side of the picture, is another prominent saint of the Dominican order. The wound on his forehead, from which blood is still dripping, indicates that this is Saint Peter Martyr. His gaze was probably intended to address the faithful in front of the altarpiece in order to point them to the Alpha and Omega of salvation with the sweeping gesture of his right arm. By following the impressive gesture of this saint, we are approaching a peculiarity of the painting that is possibly due to the special task that Caravaggio was given by his unfortunately unknown patron or patrons. In older depictions of the distribution of the Rosary, the mediation of grace always follows a clear hierarchical order, leading from the Madonna via the saints to the faithful, as here in older examples by Lorenzo Lotto. Caravaggio builds in this tradition. However, he transformed the originally Mariological pictorial tradition into an emphatically Christological program. The act of grace no longer comes about exclusively through the intercession of the Mother of God, but is attributed to the Christ child, positioned exactly in the central axis of the painting. And this Christ child is Caravaggio in its physicality in an astonishing way, emphasizing, notice how this child touches his own belly with a gesture that seems strangely oblivious. Of course, there can be no question of thoughtless naturalism here neither. Rather, the emphasized corporality of this Christ child is probably related to the sacrament of the altar, or more precisely, to the real presence of Christ in the host, in which would have appeared exactly below this bright figure during Mass celebrations. We can assume that the gesture of Caravaggio's Christ child refers to the words spoken by the priest at a precise moment of the celebration. Hoc est corpus meum. This is my body. Caravaggio translated this word into painting, so to speak, and illustrated it in a new way. This astonishing invention is probably closely linked to another one. You have long since noticed, ladies and gentlemen, that the Madonna in this painting has an earthly counterpart, namely in the form of the simple dressed woman kneeling on the ground at the bottom left, who has come here with her small child. As the only believer, she is not holding out her hands for a rosary. Her attention seems to be captivated by something else. She raises her head and apparently looks in the direction of Mary and the Christ child. Of course, we can only deduce this from the position of her head. Caravaggio does not even give us a hint of her face. He appeals to our imagination, and it seems to me in a quite successful way. Although we do not see a face, there is an unusual, intense gaze. And we are stimulated to think that the woman sees what no other believer can see in the picture, namely the other mother with child, that is, the Madonna with the child. She seems to have a vision right now, without needing the mediation of a saint. She breaks through the ecclesiastical hierarchy and sees directly from her subordinate position. Caravaggio knew how to support the idea of such a vision with a further contrast, and the child obviously remains unaware of it. Unlike his mother, he sees nothing and gazes into a dark void. Did Caravaggio's successors take up these inventions? So far, I'm not aware of any painterly quotations or commentaries from the 17th century in which the Christ child touching himself or the subtle depiction of visions would play a decisive role. There is probably still a lot to discover. But there is also already no doubt that the Madonna of the Rosary was studied carefully at the time and had an influence on subsequent art history. Peter Paul Rubens was one of the most prominent painters who demonstrably dealt with the work. As mentioned above, Rubens knew the painting from his own experience and was directly involved in bringing it to Antwerp in the 1620s. He also drew inspiration for his work from the Caravaggio. Art historical research has shown that the group of kneeling and gesturing courtiers in the foreground of Rubens' apotheosis of Henry IV and the proclamation of the regency of Maria de' Medici was adapted from people reaching towards rosaries held by Saint Dominic in Caravaggio's Madonna of the Rosary. The Medusa shield in Minerva on the right-hand edge of the painting can also be read as a Caravaggio quotation, and Rubens would thus have taken up two Caravaggio's inventions in this painting and artfully combined them. We can conclude that Caravaggio's iconographic and compositional inventions were not only eagerly studied by the so-called Caravaggisti, but also by painters like Rubens. I would now ask whether this also may apply to a painter who, based on the art theory of the 17th century, could be described as a veritable anti-Caravaggio. In order to clarify and to answer this last question in my lecture, I need to go back a little further and return to Giovanni Pietro Bellori one last time. As already mentioned, this probably most influential Italian art theorist of the 17th century sharply criticized Caravaggio for his realistic and direct imitation of nature. In his Vitae, published in 1672, he accused Merisi, among other things, of having foregone the study of great models and only have brought art to a low level by depicting vulgar and ignoble motives. For Bellori, Caravaggio became, in short, a symbol of the decline of art through his excessive naturalism, and at the same time, Bellori also highlighted positive counterfigures, starting with Annibale Carracci. As the most important antipode, he finally positioned his younger friend, Carlo Maratti, who was born 15 years after Caravaggio's death and died in 1713 as one of the most famous painters of his time. Bellori describes Maratti as a restauratore della buona pittura in Roma dopo il secolo della sua decadenza, and you all can guess what the decadenza was. He praised the grace, the clarity, and purity of form in his paintings, seeing them as the embodiment of classical ideas such as beauty, harmony, and moral grandeur. To this day, Maratti is regarded as the main master of Rome high Baroque classicism, which was inspired by Raphael and ancient sculptor and shaped by Annibale Carracci and his teacher Andrea Sacchi. Maratti's mastery stemmed in part from his precise study of canonical models. And here are a few random but beautiful examples from his early years. You see the Hercules Farnese, works by Raphael with a figure of the stanze, and works by his teacher Andrea Sacchi. He copied those in order to arrive at his own inventions on the basis of his study. All this corresponds exactly to what the art history textbooks led us to expect. What do these drawings here tell us? They are generally regarded in the specialist literature as preliminary studies for an altarpiece in the Roman Basilica of Santa Maria di Monte Santo in the Piazza del Popolo. The Maratti specialist, Prosperi Valenti Rodinot, writes about the left-hand sheet, and I quote, "The most brutal force of the pen in this sheet, with its incisive mark that does not yield to any aesthetic purpose, documents the artist's best creative phase pressed by the idea." End of quote. Could it be that Maratti was working here with inspiration that he had received neither from antiquity nor from Raphael or Sacchi? but from his supposed artistic antipode, Caravaggio. The latter had been commissioned in 1603 to paint a Madonna di Loreto for the Roman Church of Sant'Agostino, which was as popular as it is today. In my opinion, Maratti's drawings indicate that he studied Caravaggio's composition in detail and adopted some elements while omitting or correcting others. Selectively, he adopts the Madonna and Child, who stands like a statue in an elevated position in front of the architecture of the house, with a man kneeling before her. Maratti, on the other hand, transformed the poor barefoot pilgrim into a saint. And in order to show neither the dirty soles of his feet nor his hindquarters, he has turned him into profile. The brilliant light on the Madonna's face and the emphasized physicality of the Christ child also no longer appears in Maratti's work. In other words, the selective reception here goes hand in hand with a kind of criticism that can be interpreted as a painterly counterpart to Bellori's written critique. In the same year, 1686, when he was working on this Madonna with Saints, Maratti also received a commission for an altarpiece in a side chapel in a church in Forlì, and it seems as if Maratti has used or reused a sketchbook in this year, or as if he had deliberately gone through Rome, or especially through Roman churches, with a pencil and paper, and had also studied Caravaggio's first major commission, the decoration of the Contarelli Chapel in San Luigi de Francesi in Rome. In any case, it is reasonable to assume that Maratti drew on Caravaggio's famous St. Matthew when designing the figure for this church, St. Francis, for Forlì. Steffi Röttgen noted this as early as 1988 in an aside, but no further conclusion had yet been drawn from this observation. 3 years after these Caravaggio transformations, and at a time when Maratti was at the height of his fame, the 60-year-old painter received a commission from Sicily. He was to create an altarpiece for the Oratorio del Rosario in the Dominican Church of Santa Cita in Palermo. Maratti received the commission and detailed instructions for its execution in Rome, and he did never travel to Palermo directly. The altarpiece shows Mary seated on a throne in the upper half of the picture. To the left of the center, the Christ Church stands between her legs and distributes rosaries to St. Catherine of Siena, who is turned towards him, and at her feet are other holy virgins, the Santa Rosa and Oliva, and on the far left in the painting in the foreground, Santa Rosalia, who turns her arms outstretched towards the gifts of Saint Dominic and the Puto. It has long been known that Maratti had to compete with a famous predecessor for this commission. Several decades earlier, in 1625, Antonis van Dyck had received a commission for a Madonna of the Rosary from the other Rosary Brotherhood in Palermo, the one in San Domenico. The work quickly became famous, and 60 years later, Maratti, in connection with his own commission, had a copy sent to Rome. Maratti's preliminary studies, some of which particularly beautiful, are here in Madrid, in the Accademia di San Fernando. Maratti's studies reveal how seriously he engaged with the challenge posed by Van Dyck. They also show how, once again, artistic reception went hand in hand with subjective selection and criticism. One of Van Dyck's fabulous inventions is this boy running out of the picture, disgusted by the death and the smell of decay. Palermo had suffered a terrible plague epidemic only a year before this commission to Van Dyck. Maratti transforms the boy into a puto with roses in his hand, pointing above the cross and skull to the salvation coming from above. As far as the composition is concerned, however, Maratti completely rejected Van Dyck's approach. And again, I quote the Maratti specialist, Prosperi Valenti Rodino, who notes, he radically departs from Van Dyck's solemn and Baroque design, preferring a classical composition of Sacra Conversazione. In fact, the altarpiece has a pyramidal-shaped arrangement that dates back to around 1600, in which the Virgin sits in a prominent position on a raised throne. The infant Jesus is squeezed between her legs to distribute rosaries, and the saints are gathered at her feet in the foreground. I think that the reference from around 1600 can be made more precise. Maratti seems to have taken his cue from Caravaggio's Madonna of the Rosary, for whose classical composition he must have had a special sensorium. He, the artist, could see what his mentor, Bellori, could not or would not see, that Caravaggio also knew how to compose and that there was still something to be learned from him in his art. The following similarities support this selective reception. The pyramidal structure mentioned by Prosperi Valenti Rodino with a raised throne, the Christ child between the legs, and the seated or kneeling figures in the foreground, the sweeping arm of Santa Catherine with Maratti and St. Peter Martyr with Caravaggio, referring to the Madonna and Child, and the second mother in the foreground, who is not only shown in a similar three-quarter view, but is also wearing a very similar dress, if you only have a look at the square neckline at the back from which the white camicia peeps out. In addition, her long hair is similarly tied in a plait with a colored ribbon that is woven into it. The question remains as where to and how Maratti could have seen Caravaggio's Madonna del Rosario. The painting had already left Italy before his birth and entered the Dominican church in Antwerp. It is not yet known whether copies have been made in Rome or Naples beforehand. However, we know of a high-quality print by Rubens' preferred engraver, Lucas Forstermann, and this engraving, which was circulating before 1650, may also have been known to Maratti. And of course, he reproduces the painting in reverse, so I have flipped it over for you. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope I have been able to show that Caravaggio's inventiveness went far beyond the innovations usually associated with him: chiaroscuro painting, half-length figures, and naturalism, and also included questions of figure formation, iconography, composition, and pictorial narrative. Furthermore, I hope to have indicated that the inventions regularly displays a remarkable depth of thought. The neckline of Christ in the Viennese Coronation of Thorns is not only a virtuoso piece of painting that shows us the tension of a tortured body, it is also an illustration of an abysmal kind of self-surrender, ultimately the paradoxical basic figure of Christianity, where the highest regularly turns into the lowest and vice versa. Similarly, the way the young, beautiful David shoulders a sword is more than just a piece of virtuoso nude painting with an erotic frisson. One does not see the gesture in full unless one also recognizes in the specific gesture of a shepherd, and consequently reflects on the ironic relationship between the shepherd's crook and sword in the biblical narrative. And unless one notices that the shepherd, once turned hero, is about to cut his own flesh at the very moment of his triumph. Finally, the figure of the Christ child in Madonna of the Rosary cannot be seen adequately as long as we remain stuck with the prejudice that Caravaggio only painted what he could observe in his studio in front of his eyes. For the way in which the painter emphasizes the physicality of this child and how he allowed it to touch itself is closely related to the words spoken by the celebrating priest at the decisive moment of the sacrament of the altar, hoc est corpus meum. This is my body. The way in which this child touches himself, as if to reassure himself in an almost dreamlike state of mind of his own corporeality, is masterly. All this may not make Caravaggio a learned painter, but it does not make him one. But it does make him one for whom painting and thinking and painting went hand in hand. Last but not least, I hope to have shown that those painters who observed Caravaggio and who followed him already noticed a great deal of what we art historians were able to understand gradually in a long process. There is no doubt that we still will be able to learn a lot from these painters in the future. This even applies to a painter like Peter Paul Rubens, whom we do not usually associate with Caravaggio and about whom you will hear many interesting things in Ana Dieguez Rodriguez's lecture next week. What applied to Rubens may even apply to Carlo Maratti, who judged Caravaggio's art more critically than most of us do today. And perhaps it was precisely this sharp eye that allowed him to see what we today, having become insensitive, so easily overlook. Muchas gracias por su atención.